In order to explain fractional reserve banking, I need to do the following. Conrad, do you mind if I pick on you for a moment? You look like a typical banker. He's sitting there, he's kind of bald on top, and he has a nice, fancy leather coat on. His shoes are well polished, and his wife looks real neat sitting beside him with hair combed back and in a suit. And he looks like the typical local banker who would never do you wrong. And let's see, this gentleman sitting right down here, you look like the average individual who would like to deposit $1,000 into your friendly, smiling banker's bank who would never do anything wrong for you. And so you have $1,000, now you wouldn't dare do this, but let's just pretend for a moment that you would. You have $1,000 and you take it down to this gentleman's bank, he's the bank president, and you deposit $1,000 in his bank in a savings account, and it's a savings and loan. That savings and loan is allowed or is required by law to keep 5% in reserve and can loan out 95% of your $1,000, which means they can loan out $950. They loaned out that $950 to this gentleman sitting right over here who would like to build a room onto his house. So he takes the $950 down to the lumber supply place and buys that much lumber. Well, the lumber supply place does business with Bank B. This is Bank A over here. And Bank B is likewise required to keep 5%, which is $47.50, and can loan out $902.50 to this gentleman sitting right down here, who filters it back into the economy through the grocery store into Bank C, because the grocery store does business with Bank C. Bank C is required to keep 5%, which is $45.13, and can loan out $857.37. Now that money is filtered back into the economy because it was loaned to this gentleman over here, and filters back into Bank D. Bank D is required to keep $42.87 and can loan out $814.50. And you continue that scenario all the way down to zero. And sir, here's what we come up with. Your $1,000 deposit in your friendly, smiling banker's bank who would never do you wrong. Those bankers are allowed, using fractional reserve banking, to loan out $20,229.60. And it's being practiced by every lending institution in America. Oh, by the way, that doesn't even include the interest on the indebtedness. That's only the principal. Where does the interest come from? It's better known as the national debt. They turn up the presses faster and faster and faster every day in order to be able to pump more into the economy, just to bolster up the fractional reserve banking alone. And Jonathan May says they're allowed to loan out $22 for every $1 that you put in their fractional reserve banking bank's bank. Now, 13 families control the hard currency of the world, practice fractional reserve banking, and as Paul Harvey says, here's the rest of the story.
The initial final stages of the final phase of System 2000, which is the global creditors' unilateral totalitarian plan, were put into effect back in the mid-70s. A Pentagon official and 3 other U.S. government officials visited the Prime Minister of Nigeria, paid him $50 million to double, in fact more than double, the price of Bonny Light, which is the crude oil from Nigeria.
Now he says that they visited Nigeria and said that they would give them $50 million across the board in cash with no repayment if they would be willing to double the price of light oil. Basic explanation is following. Only 2 nations in the world have light crude. Light crude oil is an oil that as it comes out of the ground, it could almost be used in your automobile. It's the most valuable oil in the world. And according to the price of light crude, all other oil in the world is priced in accordance with the way those 2 nations price light crude. Whoever controls the price of light crude oil likewise controls all the oil prices in the world. Therefore, he said, they went to Nigeria, one of the 2 nations that has light crude, said, we'll give you this money if you will double the price of light crude. Now, the Arabs come into picture.
At the same time, Bush and some other of the Tri-National Commission were in the Middle East, persuading the Middle East nations and England to consolidate OPEC, of which, of course, America is also a part, but never mentioned. The deal cut with the Middle Eastern oil producers was that the oil buyers were prepared to pay significantly higher prices for the oil, provided the Middle Eastern nations supported America, this is how it was put, by investing the revenues in the big banks in America.
Arabs, who today are sheikhs and sheiks, 30 to 40 years ago were nomads roaming the deserts riding camels. The international bankers found out that there was oil in their countries. They went and persuaded them to allow them to produce that oil by financing their oil fields. After they had financed their oil fields, they charged them usury for building their oil supply systems and their refineries. After the usury had been repaid because the Arabs became rich so quickly, back in those days you were paying at the gas pump 30 cents per gallon for gasoline. First of all, the international bankers went to Nigeria, doubled the price of light crude. Then, unbeknownst to the Arabs, who had become wealthy overnight, knew nothing about international finance, had just been riding their camels out in the desert a few years ago. Now they go to them and say, we will take the price of crude oil to any place you want it to go, as high as you would like it to go, if you will take a portion of the funds that you get from this new price rise that we're going to give you and deposit it in the international bankers' banks in New York. And you must deposit it in 30-year time certificates. Are you beginning to see now why 71, 72, 73, and 74 that prices of oil skyrocketed? It was because the international bankers, who have the purse strings of the world, knew that the increase in the price of oil that was going to the Arabs would come right back to their banks as 30-year time certificate deposits. Now, watch what they intended to do with those 30-year time certificate deposits, and you begin to get a picture of what's happening.
Sheikh Imani's nephew assured us that Sheikh Imani and the other oil ministers did not know until late in the 70s, early in the 80s, that the controlling interests of the prime banks were also the same people who had the controlling interests of the major oil companies.
The sheikhs of that day and time did not understand world finance. They did not know that the international bankers were taking them, and neither did they understand that America's major oil companies, such as Standard Oil, Atlantic Richfield, and the other major oil companies, were likewise controlled by the money of the international bankers' banks in New York. Therefore, the total picture of intake of profit on the part of the international bankers was all coming back to them. These Arabs, not understanding any of this international finance, fell for the plot of the international bankers, and little by little the story becomes more bizarre.
Actually, through a joint stock trust that was set up by the original Rockefeller here in America in 1870, 3 years before the U.S. government declared joint stock trusts illegal in 1873. It is that entity that is the ultimate controlling factor in America of the prime banks, the Federal Reserve Board.
There was a joint stock trust. They're no longer legal in America, but they were set up in the 1800s, and it's under those joint stock trusts that the international bankers' banks in New York are allowed to operate, which other banks in America are not allowed to operate under. Do you wonder why the Chase Manhattan, Chemical Bank, J.P. Morgan's Bank, and the others in New York are showing all-time record earnings, while around America, literally hundreds of banks per month are going broke? The reason is because they are operating under a grandfather clause of a joint bank trust, which is no longer legal, but because of the grandfather clause, they can operate in New York, that section of banks, and in so doing take these finances and be able to manipulate with them both us and the Arabs. And with this, he continues,